Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great...
Для мене великий привілей мати можливість бути модератором такої дуже важливої обговорення сьогодні. У КМЦ мене звати Наталія Попович, я одна із співзасновників цього центру. І тема нашої сьогоднішньої обговорення, дебатів – це ціна кремлівської агресії в Україні, матеріальний вимір. Дуже важливий звіт, який був підготовлений Північною Радою, паном Андерсом Аслундом. І ми дуже раді, що у нас є така можливість провести таку подію чи таку зустріч разом із Atlantic Council, з Північною Радою.
The topic of the potential price of peace is highly relevant on one hand, but is not too often neither mentioned nor reflected upon in the international media and in the Ukrainian media. Crimea is discussed in the discourse of its annexation. We were doing a little bit of a monitoring analysis prior to this event and this effort. And it doesn't help that many of the international reports use very different terminology to call what is happening in the east of Ukraine. And it is really refreshing in that sense to talk about the potential of reparations. One of Razumkov's Center's 2016 recent studies revealed that about a third of Ukrainians believe that Russian Federation should renew the infrastructure that it destroyed during the occupation of different territories of Ukraine, and this figure was less before. Also, different agencies are checking the thoughts of Ukrainians on what should happen with the potential recovery. And answers locally vary in terms of the who is responsible for it and who should help to contribute to the potential recovery in the future, from the local businesses to the state, and of course to the Russian Federation that is now being taken under different jurisdictions to courts by both the Ukrainian state and a great number of private enterprises about which Anders will talk in great detail. Of course, most recently, the building of Kerch Bridge brought the attention of the media again back to the potential losses of Ukraine, economic, military, from this infrastructure development, and another major violation of various treaties by the Russian Federation. But all in all, again, these topics are not systemically and regularly present in the materials of the foreign media and analytical centers. So we're thankful that this topic is going to be prominently now featured, hopefully pursuant to today's discussion. I would like to present the great panel that we have today with us, both the representatives of the Atlantic Council and our guests from United States and Canada, but also the Ukrainian panelists who will have a chance to debate and express their opinions on both the report and also on the efforts of the Ukrainian state in pursuing this cause. So I would like to introduce our panelists. They don't need much of the introduction, but let's start with Anders Aslund. Please come to the floor. Anders Aslund is resident senior fellow in the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We don't have a assigned seating, but wherever you please. He also teaches at Georgetown University. He's a leading specialist in economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, and East Europe. Dr. Aslund has served as an economic advisor to several governments, notably the governments of Russia and Ukraine in different years. He's also the chairman of the Advisory Council of the Center for Social and Economic Research, Warsaw, and the Scientific Council of the Bank of Finland Institute for Economies in Transition. He's a renowned author and editor of many works, most notably Europe's Growth Challenge and Ukraine, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It. Previously, he worked at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Brookings Institutions, the Cannon Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Anders will speak as the author of this report. I'd like to call to the floor His Excellency John Herbst, Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Ambassador Ambassador Herbst served for 31 years as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, when he worked to enhance U.S.-Ukraine relations, help ensure the conduct of a fair Ukrainian presidential election, and prevent violence during the Orange Revolution. In his years in the State Department, he served as the coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, leading U.S. government's civilian capacity in societies in transition from conflict or civil strife, and to provide support to countries at risk of instability. He most recently served as director of the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University, and his work has been accoladed by numerous awards and recognitions. Another expert whom I would like to call through the floor is Alan Riley, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He's also a professor at the City Law School, City University. Alan advises governments, EU institutions, NGOs, and corporations on major strategic problems in relation to abuse of dominance, price fixing, and merger cases concerning strategic problems in the global and European energy markets. Additionally, he's an associate senior research fellow at the Institute of Statecraft, and is a regular guest columnist on competition and energy law issues with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times. We're happy to welcome Eugene Czolij with us today, senior partner at Levery de Billy, one of the largest law firms in Quebec, with more than 200 lawyers. His legal practices includes corporate commercial litigation, as well as insolvency and financial restructuring law. We know Eugene as the president of the Ukrainian World Congress, serving his second term in the capacity of the president, and coordinating this major international body of Ukrainian communities in the diaspora, and representing the interests of over 20 million Ukrainians. Eugene's work has also been recognized by many accolades, both in Canada and in Ukraine. We're delighted that Olena Zerkal had a chance to join us today. Please come to the floor. Olena is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, a public servant with tremendous experience and track record. Olena is tour de force behind Ukraine's state efforts to bring Russia to responsibility for the violations in international law. Olena has served Ukraine for many years in different capacities in the Ministry of Justice, in the International Law Department, approximation of legislation, liaison with state authorities. She has been at the forefront of Ukraine's negotiations on the EU Association Agreement, and was a member of a number of Ukraine's delegations at the various negotiations with the EU, UN, NATO, and Council of Europe, and responsible for overall coordination and planning the activities in the sphere of approximation of Ukrainian legislation to EU standards. She has worked on the corporate side, and then, thankfully for us, returned to the state career in 2014 as the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. And all Ukraine very much follows all of her and her team's activities vis-a-vis representing our case in The Hague and in other institutions. And also, we are very happy to have Yulia Klymenko, Vice President of Kyiv School of Economics. Yulia has recently joined KSE. But comes from 17 years of hands-on experience in managing large-scale companies and institutions in the private and public sectors. In particular, she served as the Deputy Minister, State Secretary of Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine, and worked as the CEO of leading property development and management companies. Yulia has extensive experience in resolving complex matters and implementing structural changes in turbulent environment, and building strong alliances with civil society organizations, key business associations, government representatives, and members of parliament. So we have an excellent panel today to discuss the report. I would like to pass the floor to His Excellency Herbst for some opening remarks, and then we will proceed with Anders giving us a thorough analysis of the report, following with the panelists' comments and remarks to it, and then happy to open the floor to your questions and observations. His Excellency.
Thank you. To keep things moving faster, I'll just speak from here.
Okay.
My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. This is the second event we've done on the issue of destruction of assets by the Kremlin and theft of assets by the Kremlin in Crimea and in Donbass. We have an excellent panel. We did an event on this in Washington in March. We hope to do an event on this during Ukraine Week in London in October. And I'd like to make special thanks to the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation, whose support has enabled us to do this project. And we think this will be very much to the advantage of Ukraine. I also should mention that Paul Thomas is here, and he is following up on our recommendation to seek out ways to go after Moscow in international courts, to make them help pay back Ukraine for the billions of dollars of damage they've inflicted. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Without too much ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Anders.
Thank you very much, Nataliya, and thank you for organizing this. And as you can hear, it's John Herbst who has come up with this excellent idea, and I've tried to check out what is actually the cost of Kremlin aggression in Ukraine. And this is purely economic. It's not about human cost. It's not about the military. So I just try to look upon what are the economic, direct economic costs of it. And I'll try to give you a number for Ukraine. And the number is $100 billion. How do I come to this? GDP in the occupied part of Donbass used to be 10% of Ukraine's GDP before. Crimea, 3.7% of GDP. That's together 13.7% of GDP. The main authority today on the cost of assets and capital is Thomas Piketty's big book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he has a simple rule. Total value of assets is four times GDP in Europe over the last 140 years. Ukraine and Russia are in the same category. There's no reason to distinguish them. So then we just multiply 13.7% times GDP in Ukraine was $180 billion in 2013 times 4, and we get almost $100 billion. So what are these losses? If we look upon Crimea, it's relatively easy. It's much more difficult with Donbass, as we'll come to. The big, if you would take Crimea, you can say that there are 5 big costs: energy, electricity, agricultural land, real estate, and banks. So if we go through the various pieces here, gas production and reserves, that's the big cost. That's belong to Naftogaz, Chernomorneftegas, and assessments there have been given at $30 to $40 billion for that alone, but that was when gas prices were high. How much is it now? Less. Naftogaz now claims in arbitration $7 billion for this. But this is the biggest cost. And the second cost in terms of size is easy. Banking, bank assets, money that were in the banks. $1.7 to $1.9 billion according to the NBO. The third point, also rather easy, Klymenko, belong to DTEC, or I should say still belongs to DTEC, and that's assessed to about $1 billion. The fourth point, agricultural land, it's 1.5 million hectares, $1.8 billion that would be at the current price of $1,300 per hectare. I would rather put the price at a more normal price of $4,000 per hectare, then it would be $5.6 billion. And then there are at least, or by May 2017, there were 4,575 pieces of real estate that had been taken over. So what do you do with this? Crimea is relatively easy for three things. First, there's no war destruction. We don't discuss war destruction there. Secondly, it was taken over by the Russian state, which means that the Russian state has full legal responsibility for it. And thirdly, these confiscations were actually done by Russian law, which means that the Russian government says that it has responsibility. It was not done as corporate raiding, for example. So it is legally quite clear. So Ukraine and Russia actually have a valid bilateral investment treaty of the 27th of November 1998. So it's just to apply this. It says that you can ask for private arbitration in a number of different places. For some reason, all the Ukrainian claimants have chosen, as far as I know, the permanent court of arbitration in The Hague. And there are at least 7 cases there. One so far has been sorted out, and it was it 19 Ukrainian entities that won $159 million. So now they only have a certain problem to collect it. You ask, can they collect it? Yes, they can collect it anywhere because this is the Russian state. So it's Russian state property in any country that has accepted the New York Convention of 1958 of collecting awards. So they can do it. It costs some to get it done, some legal costs, therefore it's good to gang together a group. Over to Donbass. Donbass is very different from Crimea. If we take the population to begin with, in Crimea, until recently they said 20,000 people had left for Ukraine, and about 20,000 had come from Russia. There's no major change of the population in Crimea. Donbass, completely different. It's unclear to see exactly how many people who lived in the occupied area of Donbass before, but say that it was 4.5 million people, and now probably 2.5 million people live in Donbass. Almost half the population has fled. 2/3 to Ukraine, 1/3 to Russia or so. And what does this tell you? It tells you that this is a hellhole. This is a place where only the old, the poor, and the criminal remain. So this is a completely different situation. And there has been mass destruction. The Ukrainian government number for this some time ago was $9 billion in sheer destruction. The Vienna Institute of International Economic Studies came out in April 2015 with a number of $10 billion. And this is then a completely different category than what we are discussing in Crimea. And unlike in Crimea, who is responsible? DNR and LNR are not recognized by anybody. Decree by these is not anything. And companies are just taken over without any legal document whatsoever. So this is more corporate raiding than anything else. Something that is normally not discussed, and it's difficult to quantify the direct cost to a country, it's the Russian trade sanctions. A little noticed fact is that total trade between Russia and Ukraine, both exports and imports, have fallen by no less than 80% from 2012 to 2016. And it means Ukraine has lost $14 billion of exports to Russia, and the imports have fallen by $22 billion. Let me just touch upon what does this cost Russia. Well, the Russian costs fall into three categories. Military costs, administrative costs for these territories, and cost of financial sanctions. So if we start with a number that we have clear, that is Crimea costs the Russian government $2 billion a year. We don't have any official number for Donbass, but probably that's about as much. So say here we have $4 billion a year in just for the Russian state to run its activities there, paying pensions, paying civil servants, and they are not collecting much in taxes. So this is 0.3% of Russia's GDP of $1.5 trillion. The second point is financial sanctions. My best understanding of it is about 0.7% of GDP each year. And then we have military expenditures. There we don't have any good number, but I would use this number. Russian military expenditures, according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, was 3.3% of GDP in 2008. In 2016, 5.3% of GDP. This is an increase by 2% of GDP. So if we add these three numbers together, first, state administration of Crimea and Donbass would be 0.3% of GDP, cost of financial sanctions because of essentially of Donbass, that's 0.7% of GDP, and then extra military costs that Russia might have wanted in any case, but let us throw it in, then we would get 3% of GDP per year. So the simple observation is this is not for free. It's not that Russia can do anything it wants. These are very substantial costs that a reasonable government would like to get rid of. So let me just end with the questions, what should Ukraine do? Well, first of all, get a full account of property lost. The inventory, I would be very interested in hearing, in particular, Olena Zerkal, who is the main person in the Ukrainian government who's responsible for this, what the situation is. And then I think one should select, as has happened now, gather several claimants together to reduce the cost and go for international arbitration. And here I know that Alan Riley is always most interested in how one can raise a complicated legal case for Russia. And then the third question, which is to the whole panel, that is, which are the best jurisdiction, and I'm particularly turning to Olena Zerkal again, because you are representing Ukraine very elegantly in the International Court of Justice, but you are also in the European Court of Human Rights at the Council of Europe. And what can be done in this international court. And as you can hear, I think that Ukraine has a very good case, and that as much as possible should be done about this in international arbitration courts as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. And I'd like to maybe turn the floor, if possible, to Lana for a second, because truly this report, on one hand, suggests a methodology, according to Piketty. And I guess my first question would be, to what extent the Ukrainian government feels that this is the methodology that is acceptable and appropriate to measure the losses. And also, the report gives a number of recommendations, of policy recommendations. So to what extent extent the government is already enacting many of them, and what is the status on that? Thank you.
First of all, thank you, and thank you for the interest to Ukraine. This is also an honor for me to be among such distinguished persons, and definitely thank you for the work you have done. But I would like to focus on a few issues. First of all, we as the Minister of Foreign Affairs represent state. And we do focus our attention on our sovereign rights. Definitely for us, this is most important issue, to protect our sovereign right and to protect our territorial integrity. That's why we are dealing with a few cases. One of them in ICJ, and it's devoted to two convention on elimination of all forms of racial discrimination in Crimea, and also this is about the prohibition of financing of terrorism. This is about the East. And there we had our preliminary hearings last year, and we continue our work, and in few days we will submit our full memorial to ICJ, and it will contain around 10,000 pages, memorial and addendums. So that's about the one case, and another case, it's about the Law on the Sea Convention and violation of our sovereign rights in the Black Sea, in Azov Sea, in the Kerch Strait. So there we are claiming that our rights as a coastal state were violated. And definitely the question of compensation also will raise there, but on the very final stage. Because the violation is continuing, and it's not the stage where we can raise this issue. Now we received objections from Russia concerning the jurisdiction of the arbitration, and we will have to respond till the 18th of June. But we also help our investors to protect their rights, and this is a very important track. We are in favor of use of this instrument which has been mentioned, the bilateral agreement on protection of investments in Crimea. And there I want to attract your attention to a few points also. We are not talking about selling Crimea. Crimea for us is a part of Ukrainian territory. We are talking about the protection of investors who unlawfully lost their rights in Crimea. And we are not talking about the title for ownership in Crimea. That is also obvious for us that the title is in Ukrainian possession. And Russia has simply usurped our right to regulate and created the double legal regime in Crimea. That's our stable position, and we submit our amicus briefs in all cases which were put in front of arbitration by Ukrainian investors and other investors. That's why I am very conscious about any kind of claims and statements concerning the cost and what Russia owns us. Because in this respect, we should be very aware about our sovereign rights. The main thing is that we are not talking about the selling Crimea. We are talking about the necessity to protect sovereign rights and protect investors who lost their properties there. But when Crimea will come back to Ukraine, we suppose that all rights will be reestablished. That's also a part of our legal theory. And we don't want to speculate with numbers. We don't want to speculate with possibilities. We do support all kinds of moves of Ukrainian state companies in order to regain their losses in Crimea. And we also accompany claims of Aslund, who actually is awaiting for the final ruling of the arbitration quite soon. And definitely we also were together with Naftogaz in their claim, which has recently been in focus of the Hague Permanent Court of Arbitration. And there we also submitted our amicus brief, where we had our special position concerning the Crimea status. And definitely non-of arbitration none of them, and there were 8 of arbitrations, put under the question the status of Crimea. They definitely admitted that Russia has an effective control over the territory, and as a party of this bilateral agreement is responsible for the protection of investments made in that territory, but on the ground, on agreement, which protects all kinds of investments. And with Donbass and Lugansk, definitely situation is more complicated because Russia is there but never ever admitted this. And that's one of kind of their policy with the green personnel in Crimea, with their presence in the east. But I think that this kind of damage can be solved afterwards, after the war, as it's usually been done in any kind of conflicts in the kind of conference or agreement. And as you might know, this is actually the last year when we have to decide concerning the future of our big agreement with Russia, concerning the partnership, friendship and partnership. And I really believe that we will manage to settle all kinds of relations and damages and restitute our rights and decide about the compensation in the framework of our next agreement with Russia. And I think that will be definitely a way forward in accordance with the international law and on the base of UN Charter.
All right, thank you, Olena. Maybe a question to Eugene, Czolij, whether in regards to what Olena had said and you know, possible renegotiations prior to this new version of the agreement,
the conflict should be resolved.
The conflict should be resolved. That's one thing. But does Ukraine need any form of a a new kind of Nuremberg process in which there would be sort of an interstate or maybe governments, public-private, sort of experts that would be determining what should be the cost for Russia of all of the damages it has inflicted in regards to annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass? Okay.
Before we get into something as complicated as a Nuremberg committee, let's start with something simpler, with what Anders has said, and he's a conservative, a person that doesn't make statements that are flippant, and he concluded his presentation by saying that Ukraine has an excellent case. Let me just tell you and whet your appetite by telling you why Anders said that. There are 3 possible venues, 3 possible courses of action that Ukrainians, be it individuals, physical persons, or corporations, can take in order to obtain a restitution for the damages that was caused. One is the 1998 bilateral investment treaty between the government of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. This bilateral agreement provides that each contracting party shall encourage the investors of the other contracting party to make investments on its territory and shall allow such investments insofar as it is in conformity with its respective legislation. And then provides in Article 5 that the investments of investors of either contracting party carried out on the territory of the other contracting party shall not be subject to expropriation, nationalization, or other measures equated by its consequences to expropriation. And in Article 6 provides for a recompense of damage, namely that the investors of one contracting party whose investments suffer damage on the territory of the other contracting party as a result of war, civil disturbances, or other similar circumstances shall be granted a regime not less favorable than the one which the latter contracting party is granting to the investors on its territory. Now, obviously, the damage that was caused on Ukraine's territory, be it in Crimea or in the Donbass. And here, in order to allow for a party that suffered damages to avail itself of this convention, one would have to invoke the doctrine of effective control and plead before an arbitration tribunal that the Russian Federation has effective control of Crimea, which would be rather hard for the Russian Federation to contradict in view of its illegal annexation and all the documents related thereto, and the effective control of at least 7% of the Donbass. And an argument could very well be made for the additional territory that is the object of daily military aggression. One final decision would be rendered by such a tribunal. As Anders has pointed out, one could avail oneself of the Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards, the Convention of New York of 1958, in order to arrest assets of the Russian Federation in various countries, Canada, the United States, and various EU countries. One such decision that was rendered on May 2nd, 2018, where the parties, a whole slew of parties, Everest Estate LLC et al., obtained a $159 million award from the arbitral tribunal based on this convention and the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law Arbitration Rules of 1976 on the basis of the interference and ultimate expropriation of their investments in Crimea. Another possible avenue is the European Convention on Human Rights, more particularly the provisions of Article 2, the right to life, Article 8, the right to home and family life, and Article 1 of Protocol 1, the right to property. Again, a decision was rendered in the Yukos case for a substantial amount of $1.86 billion in that particular case. And unfortunately, the Russian Constitutional Court denied the enforcement of the European Court, which is a first, shows the total disdain of the Russian Federation not only to human life, but to internationally recognized courts. And I believe that Article 46 will be a challenge to the Council of Europe, where the Committee of Ministers are tasked with the obligation to facilitate and ultimately to enforce judgments rendered by the European courts. So history will tell to what extent this committee will ensure the execution of judgments rendered by that tribunal. And finally, an important decision was rendered by the Supreme Court of Ukraine in March of this year in the case of Svitlichny Serhii and Svitlana Valentina, where the Supreme Court of Ukraine has decided that the applicants in that decision can sue the Russian Federation and that the Russian Federation cannot invoke its immunity because the actions of the Russian Federation in Ukraine grossly violated the principles and rules of international law, which disqualifies them from being able to invoke that immunity. So as you can see, there are already 3 possible avenues that can be used by those who suffered substantial damage as a result of the Russian hybrid warfare. I think that to answer the question that you put to me, those are some of the avenues that can be immediately taken and probably lead to what Anders has said, to an excellent case result. But I think that, and I'm sure that Dr. Alan Riley will expand on this, I think that Ukraine needs to approach this in a more systemic way in order to ensure that either a commission or an appropriate body is put in place in order to coordinate all such judicial actions, and an international tribunal for the war crimes and crimes against humanity be established in order to redress the tremendous hardship and damage that was caused to the Ukrainian people by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Czolij. I think that kind of leads us to Alan and your sort of observations and remarks. Also maybe on the policy recommendations made by the report and how they're being fulfilled, some recommendations, and then I will then ask Lana back to sort of comment on it. Thank you.
I'm going to... Okay. Thanks. It's nice to be in Kyiv. Sunny, but not too warm. Very nice. What I'm going to try and do is add a bit of flesh to the bones, what Eugene said. Now, the average Ukrainian, if you're walking down the street on Krishnatik on a sunny day in Kyiv, is going to say to themselves, isn't this a bit all mad? I mean, frankly, this is a bunch of lawyers cadging for a bit of extra legal fees. I mean, goodness gracious me, how on earth can this possibly work? I mean, at the end of the day, this is politics, it's not law. You know, and if you get a ruling somewhere, so what? You can't enforce it in Russia, can you? Ho, 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 ho. Now, of course, that is at one level true. However, on the other side of the argument, look at Naftogaz's victory in the Stockholm arbitration cases, where they got just short of $2.6 billion, and currently, somewhat alarmed Gazprom executives are finding them facing freezing orders in Switzerland. So the system can work. It can work. And the other question is, of course, is the money. I mean, one of the questions is the basic kind of Ukrainian on Krishnatik has to think about it. Says, okay, guys, this is all very well, but, you know, the money's in Russia, surely. Well, actually, the money isn't in Russia. And the greatest work on this is by Karen Dewisha in her book, Putin's Kleptocracy, where she estimates that the bribes taken by the Russian elite every year from the Russian people amount to about $300 billion. And most of that money is transported to the West, to principally the US and the UK, because of our curious common law property systems. And the figures range from around $800 billion to about $1.3 trillion. So that's a lot of money. And frankly, even the Russians haven't done that much damage to Ukraine. So that provides a potential basis on which to sue. And a lot of this is, of course, in real estate. So again, potentially relatively easily accessible. So there are systems that exist. They can be slow, but they are there and they can work. Now, there are a range of legal options. I mean, we can talk about the International Court of Justice, we can talk about the Energy Charter Treaty, there's a number of treaties, but the essential two which are important are the bilateral investment treaty that Eugene mentioned between Ukraine and Russia, and then secondly the ECHR. And the ECHR is particularly important because there's a line of case law precedent. You see that already we've had the situation that in the ECHR we've got a number of cases where Cyprus has brought cases against Turkey in relation to the invasion of northern Cyprus. and the Cypriots have won in a number of cases. So that case law precedent makes it much more easy for Ukraine to bring cases. There's a pathway already established in case law. So that makes it a lot easier. Now, as Eugene was talking about it, if you start with the Ukraine-Russia bilateral investment treaty, obviously one of the questions is that this idea of the doctrine of effective control is all very well, but you sit there and say, are we giving something away here? Because we're sort of admitting that the Russians are controlling our territory. Well, yes, you are admitting that the Russians are controlling your territory, but the point is, as a matter of principle, they're controlling it illegally. It is not, you're not actually admitting or giving away any part of Ukrainian sovereignty. You're saying these people have actually attacked our sovereignty, and the underlying principle of the doctrine of effective control is a well-known principle across all civilian and common law systems that somebody is not allowed to profit from their own wrong. So they cannot deny the application of the bilateral investment treaty against them because of their illegal activity. I think that's what is the underlying principle here, and it seems to me that's one that Ukrainians should be able to embrace. And that's what we've already got going in some of the cases in The Hague, and that's where a number of Ukrainian businesses, which Anders refers to, have brought cases. Now, clearly, those cases which are in Crimea are easier to bring. As Anders says, there is an excellent chance of winning on those cases. I mean, in the sense that once you accept the doctrine of effective control, then the evidence isn't difficult. You can simply download the instrument of annexation from the Kremlin's own website. Quite difficult to argue on that one. And then there's simply the evidential questions of who's stolen what, or who's seized what. The more difficult one is the Donbass, but even there I don't think it's as difficult as it first appears, for three reasons, three factual reasons. The first is that the evidence that already exists of the Russian organization of the original invasion of the Donbass. The second is the continuing military operations, which are supported directly by the Russian state. And third is the fact that is the level of funding provided by the Russian state in the Donbass. And those three elements together, I think, are sufficient to demonstrate effective control by the Russian state. It's trickier, but I think the basis is there to run that. The real issue, I think, for Ukrainians is for more Ukrainian companies to bring cases. And to actually do the work to actually do that. And that's an accounting of losses, and I'll come back to that later. And then the bringing of cases. Now, it is expensive to bring these cases. There's both the actual initial case, and then there is the enforcement. And so one of the real issues is what do you do about smaller and medium-sized companies? And the idea there of trying to organize groups of companies who are perhaps in the same region or in the same market sector to bring cases, that's worth thinking about. I think that's kind of something which the state can help to operate. I mean, it may well be that the US and EU governments can help as well. I think the other element of this, which I think is worth the Ukrainian government thinking about and trying to get support for, there is the Ukraine-Russia bilateral investment treaty, but there are also other bilateral investment treaties with Russia. And if you've got, say, an American company or a French company or a British company which has assets in the Donbass or in Crimea, it will be a very good idea to get them to bring proceedings against the Russian Federation under their bilateral investment treaties, because the same legal principle applies. And the more different bilateral investment treaties and different tribunals who all hold the doctrine of effective control applies, the stronger and kind of broader is your legal argumentation, ultimately in any settlement negotiations for all the losses that Ukraine has suffered, all the commercial losses that Ukraine has suffered. So I think that's another element of this which I think is important. Now, the other thing which I think is worth elaborating on is the New York Convention of 1958, because the way the bilateral investment treaties work is once you've got an arbitration ruling, you can register it under the New York Convention and enforce it pretty much anywhere in the West. That's why you have the surprised Gazprom executive facing bailiffs dispatched by Naftogaz after the Stockholm arbitration ruling. And the point of it is that freezes, those orders freeze the assets. You can't seize them until your final appeals are dispatched with. But appeals in most arbitration systems are limited, and most of the appeals fail. I should say that in relation to the Stockholm procedures, appeals from the Stockholm arbitration panel fail in 94% of cases. So the likelihood is if those assets by Naftogaz are frozen, they will automatically, Gazprom assets frozen by Naftogaz, those assets will ultimately be seized. Now, I think one of the dangers we face, and I think this is a legitimate danger, if we get going with this, the Russian state is likely to ramp up a huge info war against the international arbitration system. I mean, they've already done it to some degree already, and I think that may well be related to the UCOS case. But I suspect they're going to go on about private courts, they're going to go on about how it's a terrible breach of of not being able to use ordinary courts, and how terrible the system is, and how we should take it out. I think that's something which Ukraine needs to be aware of in this process. But I think there's a huge potential here, and we should try and use it. Now, just to move briefly onto the ECHR. As I mentioned, it has got there are tremendous advantages in it from a case law point of view, and because of the Turkish case law. And that's something we should look at. And I think particularly in relation to internally displaced people who can argue about right to home and right to property, to be able to bring cases under the ECHR. But that, again, needs organisation and it needs funding. Now, the query, again, the Ukrainian walking down Krishtatik on a Sunday would say to me, on a sunny day, would say to me, this is all very well, but, you know, where's the money? You know, I can see how the business people can get their money back by seizing assets, but you can't do that under the ECHR, and that's true. And Article 46, which Eugene mentioned, merely requires the Ministerial Committee of the Council of Europe to do something about it. But do something about it is you know, what is the question. And I think the argument is that if you do something about it now, if you bring those cases now, you create a legal claim, a justified legal claim, which can be used in the final settlement. And that brings me to my other point, which Anders made as well. We do need to actually do a full, verifiable international accounting of all Ukraine's losses. If we do such a verifiable accounting of all Ukraine's losses, first of all, is we can use that in the settlement with Russia, which we'll get at some point. The second, if we do it down to an individual level, particularly for internally displaced persons, those losses can be, that accounting can be used in ECHR cases, and that reinforces your entitlement to eventually be paid. And I have another approach to all of this, which is worth thinking.
Сплачена, компенсована. І про що треба думати зараз нехай в Україні? Багато доказів існує того, що втручання Росії у виборі і інші питання. І це потягнуло за собою більше санкцій. А крім того, американці відкриті для того, щоб ввести інші види фінансових інших санкцій проти Російської Федерації, що має на чому наполягати Україна, на роботі компенсації ООН, яка має справу, скажімо, з цими втратами, які були нанесені Іраком, Кувейту свого часу, і скільки ми не можемо прийняти будь-яке рішення, тому що Росія буде блокувати будь-яке прийняття будь-якого рішення в ООН. Ми можемо заморозити, скажімо, активи Росії, і ці активи можна дати тим, хто подає у виправдані позови. Це стосується комерційних і інших позовів з України, Грузії, це включає сюди і позови тих хто загинув у 77-му році, чи, скажімо, які були отруєні у Солсбері і таке інше. Ті, що загинув у рейсі MH17, таке інше. Це, безумовно, створює реальні позиції для того, щоб використовувати всі ці можливості на користь України і йдеться про серйозне відшкодування за ті втрати, яка понесла Україна в результаті цієї агресії. Дуже дякую вам. Я думаю, що країна не те, що буде у четвер працювати також на Хрещатики, і вона призведе до сьогодні вони голосують про антикорупційний суд. Але хтось може пояснити, коли ми починаємо цю дискусію, ми не говоримо не тільки про те, що ми видаємо якусь територію Російської Федерації. Ми говоримо про те, що всі має повернутися територію, чи заплатити за це, а годинник тікає, як то кажуть, весь час. Я хочу Олену попросити скоментувати стосовно тих зауважень коментарів Eugene. І Олена, можливо, Юлія може підготуватись, поговорити про перспективи. Ну, з точки зору Міністерства економіки, яка ваша точка зору стосовно того, що ви зробите ці калькуляції? Можливо, спочатку Юлія, а потім Олена завершиться. З вашої точки зору, що ми можемо створити холістичне розуміння наших втрат, загалом усіх втрат, яким чином можна це призвести до правосуддя? Що стосується того, що компанії чи середнього, чи малого бізнесу, які працюють у Гримучині, Донбасі, скажімо, на території, яка, на жаль, окупована Україна. Тому дуже не просто це зробити, включити в список. Я не хочу забирати часу у інших панелістів, скажу декілька речей. В першу чергу, незважаючи на сонячну погоду і те, що літо це буде продовжуватися, буде продовжуватися ситуація, можливо, впродовж декількох наступних років маємо бути готові до того, щоб фіксувати і збирати будь-які докази, інформацію про втрати, не тільки безпосередні втрати, тому що прямі втрати чи безпосередні втрати – це одна річ, є, так мовити, непрямі, посередковані втрати. У нас багато загиблих військових, у нас багато покалічених людей впродовж останніх 4 років. Ми кожного року, кожного місяця у нас величезні виплати, соціальні виплати тим людям, які були тимчасово переміщених осіб. І все це має бути додано, всі ці втрати до остаточного рахунку, так би мовити. У нас є посередкований чи непрямий вплив, це невеличкі, середні, великі підприємства, які мали переїхати і залишити свої активи на тимчасово окупованих територіях. У нас є дуже чудова мотивація для них після окупації повернутися туди, тому що, я не знаю, ми вже живемо 4 роки на території України. Вони втратили свій бізнес, вони мають думати, яка в мене мотивація повертатись на Донбас назад. І треба розпочати цю публічну дискусію вже зараз, яка є мотивація для них повертатися на Донбас, назад, забирати назад свою родину, таке інше. Ну, я вибачаюся, оскільки ви вже торкнули цього питання у нас руку, Карітас України казала, що 68% з них готові повернутися додому, коли все буде повернутися в Україні. Тобто є певні дані, це гарні підстави для продовження моніторингу такої ситуації, безумовно. Але я вважаю, мотивація з плином часу буде зменшуватися. Скажімо, і діти вже одружаться в Києві або у Львові, і вони будуть буду вчитися або отримати роботу, таке інше. Це життя. І це має бути, безумовно, частиною обговорення публічного. І які втрати, чи які у нас вартість цього. Посередкуючи напрямі, втрати будуть набагато більше, ніж прямі втрати на окупованих територіях. Це буде не 100 мільярдів доларів або євро. Цифра буде набагато більше. Ми маємо бути готові його підраховувати щодня всі втрати. Я думаю, в уряді ми стикаємося з великою кількістю проблем з правовими чи з юридичними особами, таке інше. Я не знаю, чи цього, чи в парламенті ці проблеми, що стосуються державних підприємств, яким чином вони мають захищати, можуть захищати свої права, скільки це коштувати це, чи це вносити в бюджет, чи в якісь подальші кроки. Це мають бути якісь гроші на захист і все. Ну, це моя точка зору, що прямі втрати набагато більше, ніж прямі. Ну, я думаю, щоб продовжити точку зору Юлії, ви деякі рекомендації, які є в місяці у цьому звіті, Андерс, ми маємо найняти найкращих і працювати найкращими.
Has been taken by arbitration on this claim on 19 investors. The cost was around 8.5 million. So that's why this is an issue for a lot of companies. Moreover, state companies, they are limited in their possibility to hire the best because they also need to use this system Prozoro. And it's only for the state we are able to buy the best, because we are not limited by the Prozoro rules, and we had the choice to choose companies and to choose professors despite the fact of their cost. At the same the situation with the state companies a little bit different, and the decisions which were took in 2015 concerning the easiest procedure, it's not a case now. And definitely we raised this issue not once, that we should address this at the governmental level. But the decision is still pending. Definitely it would be much more easier if such a possibility which Alan just mentioned about the collective claims exists. But it's not a case with bilateral investment treaty. It can be then a common case, but it should be the claim of each individual investor at the beginning. They should notify Russia concerning the violation of their rights and where this violation. And only then arbitration can combine them in, yes, to join this case. But definitely for small and medium enterprises, this is a big issue. There are some funds which can be used, and they exist. They are working on the profit base, but definitely that's also a question to owners, whether they are ready or not to protect their rights. And since 2014, I haven't seen any particular major interest from foreign investors to invoke the mechanism which are actually in place, whether on the ground of Ukraine-Russia bilateral treaty on protection of investments or others. So you see, there are a lot of actually hesitations. But definitely that decision which has been taken by arbitration concerning these 19 investors open the door, and we hope to see more companies. The other problem, which is also quite sensitive, this is the absence of the register on property rights and enterprises in Crimea we've lost. because the system of the state register, property register, were not finalized before the aggression. That's why we don't have the full information concerning the property we lost in Crimea and the actual titles for this property. And definitely the law on reintegration provides the provision that it should be a group which has to be established with the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories, who is responsible for the collecting of evidences and for the preparation of the broad case. And I hope that the group will be successful. And I wish them success.
Thank you. We actually did invite the representatives, other representatives of government. The representative of the Ministry of Justice could not, unfortunately, join us today, but we would have addressed some of those questions in terms of forming of the inventory and some of the questions that you kindly addressed. We would have asked them. But I guess I wanted to follow up, kind of going back to the regular Ukrainian on the street. So what should be? Is there a particular message to business, and is there a particular message to regular Ukrainian? What should people know about what's going on? What should be a call to action to them? In an essence, I really like very simple, kind of simple instructions. Like the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency recently gave an instruction to each Swedish household. Have your 6-day food supply at home in case of an aggression, and if somebody tells you that we give up, we don't give up. So people clearly know what is expected of them by their government. Like what should everyday Ukrainian know about what is happening in terms of trying to get justice for Ukraine? Your Excellency.
It gets on. What I think we're trying to do here is first, starting with Anders' excellent paper, to get a sense of the cost to Ukraine, the commercial cost of Kremlin aggression. And secondly, to encourage individuals and firms to begin to use the international legal system, and maybe not just the international legal system, to go after the Kremlin to seek recompense. You might almost call it a Lilliputian strategy. Swarm the giant with many, many people. I think that Alan and Eugene have laid out some lines of attack which are open to, let's say, an enterprising person enterprising firm that has lost their assets. I think that the problem of legal expenses is real, but manageable, because many lawyers work on a contingency basis. The fact that you've had decisions against Yukos, the fact that Naftahaz has largely won in international arbitration, and now a Dutch judge has recognized their claim on Gazprom assets, demonstrates that this is a useful area for proceeding. And while I understand, as Minister Zerkal has made clear that the resources of the Ukrainian government are limited, this is kind of an appeal to people based upon their own self-interest and their own resources to take the fight in the courts to Moscow. Another metaphor is Dunkirk. All those private boats got in and saved the British Army. Well, maybe scores of, or more than scores of lawyers, Ukrainian International, will help Ukraine pin the Russian Gulliver down.
All right, thank you,
I think
Eugene.
Kashatik, people understand that.
That's true.
That to what Ambassador Herbst was saying, for the guy that is walking in Khreshchatyk that Alan saw yesterday, the basic three things that he has to know is A, that he has rights. 2, that those rights were blatantly and grossly abused. And 3, there are legal remedies to obtain restitution, period.
Okay, Olena, Yulia, do you have anything to add to that? And then also I would like to open the questions to the, from the floor.
I would rather suggest to open the floor because I will have to leave in a few minutes.
Okay. So in particular, if any questions in particular to Olena, given the time restraints, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Андрей Кlymenko, Крымский департамент Майдана закордонных справ. Он весь состоит из экономистов, которые уехали из Ялты в 2014 году. Я, во-первых, хочу поблагодарить наших давних друзей из Atlantic Council. Они в очередной раз, еще в марте мы прочитали, когда профессор Aslund озвучил основные выводы, сделали шаг новый для Украины. Почему? Мы занимаемся темой крымских активов потерянных и уже надеемся, что к концу этого года выложим в интернет.
By the end of this year, we are going to put in online the data about the Crimean property and its assets. But the first response to the Professor Aslund assessment were as follows. Now, none of the Ukrainian politicians will not name a figure less than the figure you mentioned, or this professor mentioned before, because before that, we had such non-professional statements which first actually caused laughter and then anger on our part. Now nobody now can say that, give the figure lower than $100 billion. But you understand that this is the conservative figure, the lowest possible figure, and related to the macroeconomics. And we deal with the microeconomics. We deal with each individual enterprise or company. And we believe that sometimes this problem, I'm talking about the occupied part of the Donbass territory, this problem can be tackled easier, in Donbass. Why? Because if the Russians actually captured the Lugansk cartridge factory, and they actually took all the facilities, all the equipment from there to the Russian territory, everything is clear. In this case, there is no longer such an enterprise. It doesn't exist in Ukraine any longer. And my colleague and Yulia was talking about those things. Or if, for example, an enterprise was ruined as a result of the bombardment or the shelling, whatever, it doesn't exist any longer. It was actually brought down completely. But how we can actually assess that Mr. Putin and his machinery, all his apparatchiks, back in 2014, put in their books all the state dachas or residences in the Crimea, several spas of the Ukrainian trade unions, the former Tsar palaces with the huge territories, park territories, We know the well-known Massandra wine producer company, thousands upon thousands of hectares of grapes. And in Yalta and Alushta, each of them approximately 100 hectares each, If we're talking about the spas, 220 state spas, or they call it the resort spas here, were taken out of those. 80 are the resorts which were related to the healthcare ministry of Ukraine. I'm positive that never, unlike Naftogaz, never the Minister of Health of Ukraine is going to be able to bring their case to the court. We are just in the beginning of the road, and the main question which I would like to address Mr. Aslund and also maybe His Excellency Ambassador Herbst, does the Atlantic Council plans to take some other steps along those lines? Thank you.
I think that Minister Zerkal has just made a very important point that it's different for a company and for the country. The country does not say that if we take these 220 sanatoria that they are lost. The country says we are going to get it back later. If you take a company that has lost a factory, it says, okay, pay for it. We can't use that factory again. It's approximately the same as you mentioned in Donbass, that a factory has been taken away or that it has been destroyed. So therefore, I think Minister Zerkal very appropriately pointed out that the government must argue in a different way than a private individual or a private company can do. I think that answers your questions. I don't know if you want to say something about what the Atlantic Council will do in the future.
We've just started in this field. So as I mentioned, we'll do an event similar to this in London in order to raise the profile there for the issue. But we'll be looking for ways to capitalize on initiatives of individual firms and individuals. I mentioned Paul Thomas and what he's doing. And so there'll be additional action steps.
I think we have a question from Paul Thomas, or comment.
Yes, my name's Paul Thomas. As John mentioned, I'm leading an initiative just now involving the Ukrainian American Concordia University, a couple other institutions, NGOs, to implement the very first recommendation that Atlantic Council made, which is to create this complete inventory with defensible market values. Now, to make this bite-sized and doable and non-political, we're focusing exclusively on residential property owned by Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian legal persons in the Donbass that was damaged and destroyed, because this is the one group that is very underrepresented. You don't go out as a family that lost your flat in the Donbass to the war, and you don't go out and sue. So we need to think about this in a class action way. So what we're hoping to do is to create this database with lots of corroborating evidence, using a lot of high-tech little tricks. We're going to create a mass appraisal system, and we're going to put defensible values as of the time it was damaged or destroyed. And again, focusing exclusively on the most vulnerable, least represented folks, which are private citizens who lost their family's flat. We obviously hope that the Justice Ministry and others in the government will use this information to go forward in a class action way, so that we can support these folks as well as major corporations.
Let me just maybe, Lana, if you want to say some concluding remarks before you leave, because I understand you have to go.
Definitely, this is one of the most crucial topics now for the discussion, which is the way forward. How we can help our legal entities and citizens to protect their rights and to restore their rights. I personally see the way forward in creation of special funds, where the government or the state can, together with private investors, envisage some money, some funds, in order that they can be used in protection of the rights of those who lost property and who lost rights, possessions, and so on, and not able to finance by themselves. This is kind of actions which is definitely in our agenda, and I do think and I do believe that my colleagues in government will think about this more carefully. But I have to apologize, there is a cabinet meeting in 5 minutes, so I have to leave.
Thank you so much for being with us. Yeah, thank you. I know that there was a question from Jog, so the mic. Thank you, Lana.
Hello, Jock Mendoza-Wilson from System Capital Management Group, which is the business group of Rinat Akhmetov, and we're very proud to be associated with the Atlantic Council in the production of this report. But just to say, we're one of the major losers that the report identifies with seizure of multiple assets in Crimea and in Donbass. In Donbass alone, over 40 of our assets have been expropriated, 60,000 people made unemployed. And we place, conservatively, the loss to our business alone at about $4 billion in Donbass and $1 billion in Crimea. So when I ask my next question, it's because I have my boss has a very good interest in this, which is, Professor Riley, you talked about the actions that could be taken in order to perhaps secure a recompense for the expropriation of those assets. Would you like to put maybe a timeline on how long you would expect that may take from the creation of the action, the decisions of the court, the referral under the New York Convention, and then actually restitution by whichever means, ensuring that we're paid for what we've lost?
On the whole, these cases can take some time, and the classic one that this is the bad news. I'll come back to the good news a bit later. It can take a long time. The UCOS case was launched, I think, in 2005, and you could argue it was exceptional. The legal claim in that case was for about $102 billion. And they launched it in 2005, and they got a ruling in 2014, 9 years later, for $50 billion. And then it was appealed. The Dutch, it's appealed. Very surprisingly, it was overturned in the Dutch District Court, and now it's on appeal to the Dutch appeal courts. The likelihood is that case will be reinstated. So you sit there and think, my God, it could take so long, and then you can lose on appeal. I think that's exceptional. I think the issues here are much more, once you accept the doctrine of effective control, and particularly if you're talking about your 1 billion, the assets in Crimea, I would have thought you are talking about much shorter periods of time, very little in terms of legal defensibility. So I would think more about 3 years to get to a situation where you've got a ruling and you can potentially then enforce it. And also, if you look at the Stockholm arbitration, it's around a 3-year period. So I think that's what I think is what you'll go for. And then the point about the procedure under the New York Convention is that usually what you do is you freeze, deal with any appeal, and once the appeal basically is in your favor, which is most of the time it will be, then you seize. And the point is once you've got them frozen, which you can do fairly quickly after you've got a ruling, as the Naftogaz case shows, then you pretty much got it. The thing about it, I would say also, is that the other issue to realize is that there is enormous amounts of Russian assets around. I mean, there are obviously things like Russian state-owned companies, or Russian connected state companies, Rosneft and Gazprom and Lukoil, but also you've got huge amounts of assets which are the Russian elite stuffing money abroad. Now that's trickier in one sense, because you say, whose assets are these really? These are merely innocent Russian individuals. But if you take the view, let me give you a sort of example. Let us suppose there is a director of a major Russian state-owned company which owns a $100 million villa in Palm Beach. He's paid, shall we say, $75,000 a year as a director of the Russian company. You cannot possibly be able to explain where the sources of funds are. So you argue that the funds are essentially Russian state funds, which he has corruptly obtained. Ergo, you are able to freeze and seize. Now that requires some corporate intelligence guys to go out and dig on all of this, to do the forensics. But fundamentally, that you can seize that, and the numbers of that sort of asset in the West, particularly in the UK and the US, are enormous, apparently. So that's the way I think you go. And I think it seems to me that if you look at it, if you put it as a whole, you've got something which is fairly concrete and deliverable. The other point I would make, which I think is worth thinking about from your boss's perspective, is this. By seizing all of those assets, by going through that procedure, what you do is you create the legal precedent, particularly on the effective doctrine of control. You also get courts around the West recognizing that the Ukrainians will be doing this, it's perfectly reasonable. The point is that if you think about all of the smaller Ukrainian companies who couldn't afford to bring this, once you establish a legal precedent, one of the things that will be possible is you can actually get litigation insurance funds to come in and actually fund the cases, because the precedent's been set by SCM are there, and large numbers of Ukrainian companies can then follow them down that track. Once you've got a precedent, it's much easier to get insurance funds, and I would say that both in the US and the UK, there is a huge legal insurance market, which looks at funding claims. So, as I say, once you've established a precedence, then it will be much easier to fund. Because the central point, the pitch I would make if I was going into a litigation fund in London, would be to say, we've got the precedents, the SAM group have shown that. We've got the we've got the actual target in terms of the foreign assets which we can seize. This is a doable legal proposition. And that's how you'll be able to fund a huge number of smaller Ukrainian companies.
Thank you. I'd like to give a floor to Svetlana Nezhnova from Czolij, who had their own experience of defending their rights.
Здравствуйте.
Good afternoon. I'm manager of Chernomornaftogaz. My name is Svetlana Chernova. Chernomornaftogaz is the largest enterprise which was lost on the territory of the Crimea. In addition to that, Ukraine lost real big opportunities to recover, to produce gas and oil in the shelf area in the Black Sea. I'm not going to talk about where in our case, Chernomornaftogaz for compensation or the lost property, and those cases are being considered already for a couple of years. But I have a specific question, and I would appreciate if you actually can advise me what we can do along those lines. We all know that the Kerch Bridge has been built, which actually connects the Crimea with the rest of Russia, or with the Russian territory. In addition to that, they also laid the gas pipeline, which is now partially commissioned or partially operated. Russia did that because they do not want to have any international sanctions regarding the gas fields, which they use to produce or recover the natural gas, which is between Ukraine and Ukraine territory. I have a list of those enterprises which participated in laying or building this kind of gas pipeline. So my question is, what kind of international sanctions can be used against those companies who are involved in such a project? And the second question is, what sanctions can be applied to the illegal managers of Chernomornaftogaz who work now in the Crimea? And they have this kind of fake Chernomornaftogaz with a list of different countries. I'm talking about 9 managers who, since 2014, were actually managing all these kind of stolen assets.
The sanctions against any economic activity on Crimea, they are massive. I looked up on official exports from Crimea during the first 2015 in comparison with 2013. It was a decline of 90%. So and you saw the example of Silavrie Machiny in St. Petersburg, belonging to Alexei Mardashov and Siemens, that they delivered 4 turbines to Crimea. The immediate result was that Siemens had to sell. I think they had 48% of Silavrie Machiny. And that Syllabri machine fell under severe US sanctions. So the sanctions against utilization of Chernomorod-Neftegas's fields and equipment on Crimea should be effective. On this, the second question, this is more legal questions about the rights of usage of the territory. Perhaps that's for you, Alan.
Yeah, I'm interested in the fact that they've built a gas pipeline and presumably exporting gas from Crimea to Russia, because of course that raises a lot of. No, it's the other way around. I understand. Okay, sorry. Well, okay, that makes more sense. Well, that makes more sense. That the potential range of sanctions. Then I think what the focus is the sanctions on those companies, and we can actually follow through with that quite significantly. The only question really is identifying those companies and ensuring that the EU and US authorities know where those companies, who those companies are, and ensure that the trail sanctions applied in full to those companies. The other point about it, which is really significant, is this: there is a real sense that we need to do this in a quite determined manner, because the more that we impose those sanctions now, the less likely it is that any other companies will do the same thing in the future. I'm sure the Siemens case has had some deterrent effect, and I think if we ensure sanctions are fully applied to the companies involved with the pipeline, then I think that would act as a significant further deterrent. And that is really quite important.
Sorry, I forgot to say also, you can see that the Russian state banks that are sanctioned in a softer degree, Sberbank and VTB, they are so afraid of falling under the much more severe Crimean sanctions that they refuse to work there. So instead we have special Russian state bank, what is it called, First Republican Bank, that is operating in these occupied territories. So don't underestimate the impact of severe US sanctions. Thank you.
Sorry, Eugene.
Just wanted to add that sanctions, if you're asking the question which sanctions can be imposed, sanctions are essentially a political decision of any government. And at this point, for that type of activity, we have seen many governments willing to impose sanctions for the violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I think it's up to the Ukrainian authorities and various interest groups in order to ensure that that type of activity becomes the subject of future sanctions.
All right, do we have any more questions from the floor? Yes, we do. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Günther Fellinger from Austria. I'm from Europeans for Tax Reform, and I worked in Kosovo before. And my question is, why is the international community not supporting Ukraine more with its own agency? In Kosovo, where there was also massive exchange of territory and land and a major property rights situation, there was the Kosovo Property Agency created, which was basically financed by the US and by the EU, and it has then helped all the property owners very much to get their rights back. Why not do the same in Ukraine?
Thank you. Your Excellency.
I think you need to look at this. I mean, your idea is an interesting, a good one. I think there's been a failure to do this, just as there's been a reluctance initially to recognize the extent of the Kremlin's crime in Ukraine, and a reluctance in the West to produce a variety of measures punishing the Kremlin for its dangerous actions. While the United States put down serious sanctions for Donbass in July of 2014, it took the shoot down of the Malaysian airline to bring the EU along with serious sanctions. And I've been calling for sending lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine for 4 years, and it took 3.5 years for the US administration to make the decision. The good news is that Western policy, Washington and European policy has become stronger. The bad news is it all takes time. But I think your idea is something that can be thrown into the mix as we look at what comes next.
Thank you for that. Do we have one more? Thank you.
Меня зовут Искандер Бариев, я представляю...
I believe I represent here the Majlis of the Tatarian people, and social center of Tatar people. Speaking about today, it's clear that the indigenous people are deprived of the right to get back their land, or the process, if you're talking about the process associated with the racial discrimination in different manifestations of that. Can we think how somehow to link the stealth of the property, which was associated with the deportation of some of the people, Tatar people, Crimean Tatar people in 2014, and what is going on today, just to establish a very direct link between the two events. I'm not talking about what happened before that.
So for you, Alan. I mean, there may well be other opportunities to, if you're talking about a targeting of a specific people, like the Crimean Tatars, then I think there may well be other options in international humanitarian law. One of the issues, if you look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, whether or not the specific targeting is sufficient to constitute a crime against humanity. So I think there are a number of other ranges of operations. The most one which seems to me is that there's a range of ECHR arguments about deportations and so forth, which you would be able to apply in relation to the Crimean Tatars. But the ICC and the Rome Statute is another. It may well be another route as well to do this. It's not just we're not just talking about civil or commercial claims. We're dealing with something which is of a much higher order. If you use a parallel, to use an analogy used earlier, was this takes on a more Nuremberg reflection in terms of the way that they're targeting a particular ethnic group.
Thank you for that. If we don't have any more questions, Pavlo, on the rights of a representative of UCMC.
Yeah, I'm Pavlo Tus from UCMC, and the question is as following. So, given that we will negotiate our future cooperation and friendship with Russia, do we need to put on the table the question of investment outflow caused by the conflict in Ukraine and the issue of Ukraine's GDP, which almost halved after the outbreak in Donbass?
I think actually capturing the full losses is a really challenging task. One of the examples, for example, the things which we haven't talked about is the impact on the port of Mariupol of the collapse of trade because of the Russian control of the Azov Sea and the Kerch Peninsula Strait. So there is a how do you capture that? But I think, sorry, I'll pass it over a second. I think that is one of the questions here, is to try and capture the full. How do you capture the full economic cost? I'm going to pass it over to Anders.
Well, I think that the simple answer is that everything is open to negotiations, and it very much depends on what is the outcome. Normally you would not expect to be able to demand a match. If you want to take the opposite example, I think the most striking is how Iraq was beaten after it had taken over Kuwait. I don't remember the amount, but it was tens of billions of dollars that Iraq was obliged to pay Kuwait. Admittedly, it never did so, and eventually it was written off. But that was because of the US taking over Iraq. But that's an example of a massive reparation. And of course, we can go back to the Versailles Peace, but nobody really wants to go back there. So reparations can be however big, or in most cases they don't exist.
All right, well, thank you for that. I would probably invite any one of you who would like to make any concluding remarks, but again, to congratulate you and thank you for the significance of this report that you produced. Hopefully, in terms of the policy recommendations, at least some of them will be implemented sooner rather than later. Sincerely hope that in either through this proposal of, Kosovo Property Agency or through this mechanism that Lana had mentioned as the possibility to not only create this full inventory, but also to create a fund that would enable the individuals and maybe businesses of different sizes to start more proactively trying to defend their rights. More could be accomplished either through these class action types of suits or the joint joint claims cases, and that will take us to the next step in between. As Ukraine is preparing to renegotiate or resettle this major agreement, if it's going to come to it. Thank you so much. If there is anything else you'd like to add, please do. But otherwise, I think we have thoroughly discussed all of the points of the report. And I sincerely hope that for the Atlantic Council, there will be partners in Ukraine, maybe like the Kyiv School of Economics or others, who might help in trying to capture this holistic cost of war that Ukraine is experiencing.
I can just add, following up on your comments, and we thank you for your partnership with us today. Any enterprising folks in the audience and beyond who have good information on this subject, want to write an article, you're all familiar with Ukraine Alert and our blog at the Atlantic Council, which receives a great deal of attention. So we welcome new authors, and work in this field is very important. And actually, let me also mention that yesterday we opened our disinformation portal. This is on our blog site. It's connecting many of the experts in Ukraine, in the United States, in the West, who are following Kremlin disinformation. You go online and find it. We have at this point over 100 partners, and that number is going to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the others.
One thing.
Oh, sure.
When I was in law school, a professor told me that when you have a poor case in law, you plead the facts. When you have a poor case in facts, you plead the law. And when you have a poor case in law and facts, you confuse the issue. I think that's probably the only defense that the Russian Federation would have if one would exercise the remedies that we discussed today. And I would certainly encourage Ukrainians to take advantage of their rights and to either collectively or individually exercise those rights and obtain compensation. I would certainly encourage the Ukrainian authorities to review, in view of what Mr. Thomas was saying, the legislation pertaining to class actions to ensure that the legislation dealing with class actions is as effective as possible. And I would also encourage Ukrainian authorities to create a commission that would help its citizens exercise fully their rights.
Thank you, and we sincerely hope that elections or no elections, this work will continue because it is truly paramount for Ukraine. All right, thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you to our audience for being with us today. Thanks.